blood needed for a baby that's choking, 804 High Street.
In 1994, an infant was rushed to a hospital emergency room with a serious breathing problem. The baby's lungs were bleeding, a life-threatening condition which is extremely rare. Within months, there were over 30 cases in Cleveland just like it, a rate 1,000 times higher than anywhere else in the world. Not all of the infants survived. Doctors had never seen anything like it and frantically searched for the cause. On a chilly November evening, Nima Williams heated some baby formula for her 6-week-old son, Brian. But during that feeding, something went terribly wrong.
I heard him regurgitate, so I figured it was milk. But instead, when I picked him up, instead of seeing white milk, I'm seeing bright red blood.
Her baby was rushed to Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland, where doctors struggled to save little Brian's life. X-rays revealed that Brian's lungs were filling up with blood. Unable to breathe on his own, he was taken to intensive care and placed on a ventilator.
The sections are still pretty bloody.
I'm wondering it, but I'm not thinking it. My baby's gonna be okay. We gonna get through this. So, but it's still in the back of your mind, he could die. Is this the last I'm gonna see of Brian? Is this my last look at him?
Brian was quite sick. He had bled a lot. He had dropped his hematocrit almost in half and required an acute blood transfusion, on top of having to be supported with a ventilator.
Brian Mitchell's condition was diagnosed as idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, which means unexplained bleeding in the lungs. Lung bleeding is usually caused by a heart problem, an infection, or child abuse. But in Brian's case, doctors eliminated these as possible causes. The hospital's medical records revealed 2 other babies had been treated for unexplained lung bleeding, and one of those babies died. The incidence of lung bleeding in infants was 1,000 times higher in Cleveland than anywhere else in the world. Brian Mitchell was fortunate. After 2 weeks of improvement, he was released from the hospital. His doctors suspected that his lung bleeding was caused by an allergic reaction to his baby formula, and they recommended his mother change the type she was using. But 1 week later, Brian Mitchell was back in the hospital with more lung bleeding.
I was just to the point, what's wrong with him? He starts bleeding, we bring him to the hospital. You leave him in the hospital for 3 days, but you can't tell us why he's here. You can't tell us what's wrong with him. Why does he keep bleeding? I don't know.
Dr. Dearborn discovered that Brian Mitchell and the other sick babies all lived within a 6-mile radius of the hospital on Cleveland's east side.
It was probably an environmental component. It said not necessarily that it was in their homes, but something in that part of the community was problematic.
But there was a complication. Brian Mitchell had a twin sister, Brianna, who lived in the same house, ate the same food, and slept in the same room as Brian, and even shared the same crib. If Dr. Dearborn was right and the cause was environmental, why did little Brian get sick while his twin sister was perfectly healthy? And there was another problem. Only infants were getting sick. None of the older children or adults in the same neighborhood or even in the same homes were affected. Dr. Dearborn knew he needed help and called in the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta.
The fear is we were going to continue to have more of these babies and that we wouldn't get them too late to save them.
Something mysterious was happening in Cleveland, causing the lungs of infants to bleed for no apparent reason. It was an outbreak unlike any other before in medical history. And it was happening, ironically, within a 6-mile radius of a children's hospital. The Centers for Disease Control assigned Dr. Ruth Etzel to lead the investigation in Cleveland. Her job was to find out what caused the death of one infant and the life-threatening illness of 7 others.
The job of a medical detective is an awful lot like the job of a criminal detective. That is, we're looking to try to track down the culprit of a specific unknown disease. And if we can track down that culprit, we can prevent him from attacking again.
Dr. Etzel reviewed all of the medical records of the infants with pulmonary hemosiderosis. One thing caught her eye. Many of the infants improved in the hospital, but started bleeding again after they returned home.
Use soaps and things like that to clean it up.
The families of the sick infants were interviewed using a 230-item questionnaire to see if they differed in any way from the families of healthy children. All of the homes were tested to see if the pesticides used were the type approved for residential use. And air samples from the homes were also collected. Within days of the investigation, 2 more babies with pulmonary hemosiderosis were rushed to the hospital from the same neighborhood. The total number of cases was now 10.
9 of those 10 were male, and all of them were African American. So this made us start thinking as to whether we were dealing with something related to the genetics of race, whether we were dealing with something that was particularly susceptible in males. Those were in the background of our considerations of still primarily something in the environment was probably causing this.
But if the cause was environmental, why was Brian Mitchell sick while his twin sister, Brianna, was healthy? Both slept in the same room, in the same crib, ate the same food, and breathed the same air.
Here, an infant who had no outward signs of bleeding had had ongoing low-grade bleeding for several weeks. And yet, at any time, she could have had a stress and she would have bled to death. So this said to us, not only frightening for her, but frightening for the community. How many infants like Brianna were out in the community that were showing no real significant problems? How deep was this iceberg?
As the mystery intensified, so did the fear among parents in Cleveland's East Side neighborhoods. The level of pesticides in the sick babies' homes were all within normal range. And there was no difference in air samples collected from the homes of the sick children than those collected from the homes of the healthy infants.
We want to prevent another death, we want to prevent another case, and we didn't know where to reach out to next. So I think all the public health authorities involved, state, federal, local, were really trying to get together in a think tank and figure out some answers because we didn't have any.
But the data gathered from the questionnaires began to reveal some important information. 7 of the 10 sick children lived in homes with cigarette smokers. All of the sick babies had been bottle-fed. None had been breastfed. And all of the sick babies lived in homes that had recent water damage. Was it possible that smoking, baby formula, or something in the water was causing the deadly outbreak of the bleeding lungs in infants? Or was it something else? Dr. Ruth Etzel spent weeks trying to figure out what was causing the mysterious lung bleeding among infants in Cleveland. There had been 10 cases reported so far, with 1 death, and Etzel was afraid there would be more. During the investigation, Dr. Etzel met with a friend for dinner. She was a physician and a fellow medical detective from Brazil. She mentioned a lecture she once attended and couldn't recall all of the details, but said the lecture described how mycotoxins cause the serious illness of some Brazilian children. After dinner, Dr. Etzel rushed to the library to read all she could about mycotoxins. When she cross-referenced the words mycotoxin with the word hemorrhage, the computer led to an article about a mold called Stachybotrys atra. The article described how Stachybotrys atra, found in some grain in Europe over 40 years earlier, caused livestock to bleed internally and die. Stachybotrys is a dark green, almost black, slimy mold. It often grows on cellulose-based items like straw and paper after coming into contact with water.
I began to wonder if mycotoxins could make animals sick when they ate grain that was moldy. Could it be possible that mycotoxins could make babies sick if they breathed them in?
To test her theory, Etzel contacted Dr. Bill Sorensen. He's a mycologist who had done some research on the Stachybotrys mold. Sorensen knew that the only possible way that Stachybotrys could get into a baby's lungs was by the spores, the tiny, almost invisible seed-like structures which are produced in the mold. Once the mold dries, the spores become light and powdery and can flake away, traveling great distances through the air.
And so therefore, it would be possible, if the spores are present in large enough numbers in the homes and released into the air, that they could be inhaled and produce disease symptoms.
There were 400 different types of spores found in the homes of the sick babies. The spores were placed on culture plates and left to grow for 10 days. When Sorensen analyzed the culture plates, he noticed that many contained a dark green, almost black mold. Under a microscope, Sorensen noticed that the samples from the Cleveland homes were structurally similar to the mold which killed the livestock in Europe. It was, in fact, Stachybotrys atra. Investigators now knew that spores from Stachybotrys atra were in the air of the sick babies' homes. But they needed to know whether the Stachybotrys spores in Cleveland contained the same toxins as those which killed the livestock in Europe. To find out, scientists grew the spores found in the Cleveland homes in a mixture of rice. Stachybotrys grows well in rice because of the moisture in the grains. The mold was then ground and mixed with a series of solvents to extract the chemicals contained in the spores. Using what is called high-performance liquid chromatography, the physical characteristics of the spore chemicals were analyzed, and scientists discovered that the Cleveland spores were identical to the highly toxic mycotoxins that killed the livestock in Eastern Europe. They were a special class of mycotoxins called trichothecenes.
The trichothecene mycotoxins are among the most potent protein synthesis inhibitors known. By that, I mean they disrupt the ability of cells to make proteins, and without that ability, a cell will die.
When scientists searched the homes of the sick children, they found the source of the Stachybotrys spores in mold found growing in the basements. The mold was found in all but one of the sick babies' homes. But Stachybotrys was also found in half the homes tested where healthy children lived. If it was Stachybotrys that caused the death of one Cleveland infant and the serious illness of 9 others, why didn't it affect all of the infants who lived in homes where it was found? Spores from the Stachybotrys atra mold were found in all but one of the sick infants' homes, but were also found in half of the homes of healthy children living in the same neighborhood. Scientists wanted to know why some children developed lung bleeding while others did not. They soon discovered that the number of airborne spores in the sick babies' homes were far higher than in the homes of healthy children. In effect, the homes of sick babies contained more spores and more poison.
Stachybotrys is generally not considered one of the major components in indoor air, major fungal components in indoor air. In fact, it's often not observed at all. In a study in Canada, just a few years ago, they examined a few hundred houses. I don't remember the exact number, but they saw something like 3 colonies in all of these houses combined. We observed levels as high as 600 colony-forming units per cubic meter of air in some of the Cleveland homes.
Researchers found the source of the Stachybotrys spores in the basements, growing on walls, on boxes, and even on the insulation behind the walls. For Stachybotrys to develop, 2 things are necessary: a cellulose product and water. Researchers discovered that some heavy rainstorms caused the sewer system in the geographic cluster of case homes to overflow, which produced flooding in many of the basements. In other homes, the residents said they had some leaking pipes. The water was not immediately cleaned up and soaked through the drywall and the insulation inside the walls, creating the perfect medium for Stachybotrys to grow in the warm, moist, dark environment. But if the Stachybotrys was in the basement of these homes, how did the children come into contact with the spores, since none of the sick children had been in the basement? Researchers discovered that when the mold dried, the spores flaked away and became airborne. The furnaces of these homes all drew air from the basement instead of the upper floors. The spores were sucked into the furnace, traveled through the ductwork, and made their way into every room of the homes. Tragically, they were blown into the rooms where they could do the most damage, into the infants' bedrooms, where the babies spent most of their time sleeping. Once inside the infant's lungs, the spores released the mycotoxins called trichothekines, which prevented the infant cells from making the protein needed to hold their tiny vessels together. With the vessels now weak and fragile, an external trigger may have caused the tiny vessels to rupture and bleed. Since most of the sick babies lived in homes with cigarette smoking, this may have been one of the triggers. And none of the sick babies had been breastfed, leading researchers to suspect that breast milk offered some sort of immunity. Older children and adults were not affected by the Stachybotrys spores because their lungs were better developed. And once researchers found how the Stachybotrys spores traveled from the basements to the children's rooms, they discovered why little Brian Mitchell was so much sicker than his twin sister Brianna. Although the two slept in the same crib, Brian slept closer to the heating vent, where he probably inhaled more spores than his twin sister. By the time the investigation was over, there were over 30 cases of pulmonary hemosiderosis in Cleveland, and 4 young infants died. Health officials urged parents to remove all visible mold with bleach and water, and to clean up water damage immediately to prevent the mold from developing. 1 year after this investigation, the coroner in Cleveland reopened the files of 117 babies who died from what had been listed as sudden infant death syndrome. Lung tissue samples from their autopsies were re-examined in light of what doctors now knew about Stachybotrys atra. In 6 of those samples, the lung samples turned blue, an indication that the babies had bleeding in their lungs prior to their death. Officials believe that Stachybotrys atra may have played a role in those 6 deaths. Yolanda Prevost is the mother of one of those 6 babies. Knowing the true cause of her daughter's death helps bring some closure to her family's tragedy.
I don't think that you could get any worse than this outside of literally going to hell alive. There's nothing worse than this. It's not, because you'll never get over. This is something you will never, ever get over. And you'll always wonder, what could I have done? No matter how many times you hear there was nothing you could have done.
I feel remorse. I feel their pain. Because I was standing there at one time, wondering if my son's gonna die.
Nima Williams is thankful that her 2 children, Brian and Brianna, both survived their encounter with Stachybotrys atra.
When I see a little baby's face who is doing well, I think way beyond myself and thank the help that has come to all of us in trying to sort this out, because we didn't do it alone.
Something simple, but so deadly, I mean, Mother Nature has a bunch of stuff out there that we don't know about yet, and this was one of them.
Shortly after daybreak in Vancouver, British Columbia, a fire was set to the contents of a garbage dumpster. No one saw the arsonist or the fire as it burned for hours in the deserted parking lot. But there was more than garbage in the bin, and it would take sophisticated science to identify the evidence in the ashes. When Milton Diaz walked towards the dumpster to empty some trash, he noticed that the bin was warm. When he looked inside, he noticed a small, charred figure in the corner, so badly burned it was beyond recognition.
I know something was burned, but what was it? Was it an animal or was it a person? If it was a person, it was too terrible to happen. It was too out of what I can conceive that someone would do to another human being.
The charred remains were carefully removed and taken to the morgue, where the gruesome and difficult task of identification would begin.
Straight away we knew we wouldn't have fingerprints, and we knew we wouldn't have the normal means to identify a victim because of the condition of the body.
All that remained was the equivalent of 35 pounds of charcoal-like material. It was an enormous challenge to Vancouver's medical examiner, Dr. Laurel Gray.
Well, obviously we didn't have a whole lot to work with. We had no idea what the cause of death was, whether it was related to the fire or some other matter.
During the autopsy, Dr. Gray could not find any recognizable skin, but did find a small patch of hair where the head pressed against the floor of the dumpster. It appeared to be reddish blonde in color, but the intense heat destroyed the hair follicles, which could have been used for DNA testing. X-rays of the victim's skull revealed several pieces of metal and a fractured skull, evidence of gunshot wounds. Bullet fragments recovered from the brain came from a .22 caliber weapon, but they were so badly damaged they could not be used for ballistic identification. Police now knew that it was a homicide case.
The gunshots had caused obvious, very severe damage to the brain. They had fractured many of the facial bones. There was a lot of blood in the within the facial bones and the sinuses.
The blood in the sinus cavities meant there was active circulation when the bullets entered the victim's brain, indicating that the heart was beating when the shots were fired. But the intense heat altered the victim's blood chemistry, making it impossible for any kind of DNA analysis. An examination of the victim's lungs showed no signs of smoke inhalation, which meant that the victim was dead before the fire. The internal organs revealed that the victim was an adult female. To help with the identification, investigators called in Dr. Larry Cheevers. He's a forensic odontologist who was asked to study the dental remains of the victim.
This was a victim of an inferno, an absolute unqualified inferno. There was virtually nothing left.
But when Dr. Cheevers looked closer, he was surprised to see beneath the charred surface that the jawbone and teeth were intact.
Because they're surrounded by barriers, there's saliva in the mouth, the gases in the stomach expand and push the tongue out, and the outer muscles of the face become quite leathery. And so the one thing that survives above all else is the teeth.
By studying the growth patterns of the teeth and skull, Dr. Cheevers estimated that the victim was between 24 and 30 years of age. And when Dr. Cheevers looked closely at the X-rays, he discovered an important clue. The victim had an extremely rare dental condition called mesiodens. It's an extra tooth which never grew into place on top of the two front teeth inside the gum. The X-rays also showed a lot of high-quality dental work.
When you start talking 48 hours past the finding of the body and you don't have an idea who the suspect is, and at that stage we didn't know who the victim was, you start thinking, well, it's going to be a long haul and it's going to be a difficult case.
Greg Middleton covered the search for the identity of the victim and her killer for the Province newspaper in Vancouver.
They told me at the time that they thought that there was no hope of solving it, that they had so little to go on that they didn't think that they were going to get anywhere.
Police now had a horrific murder, but still couldn't identify the victim or her murderer. When the police reviewed all recent missing persons reports, one in particular caught their eye. It was for a 30-year-old woman named Lynn Breeden. She had blonde hair and was last seen on the day before the charred remains were discovered. When the dental records for Lynn Breeden were compared to those from the charred remains, doctors noticed the same extra tooth above the gum line on top of the front teeth. And the dental work matched the burn victim as well. Dr. Cheevers was convinced that Lynn Breeden was the person burned in the fire.
There was absolutely no doubt in my mind the minute I saw the mesiodens there, and then obviously the other dental work, and they all added up to the fact that this was the same individual, or the same unfortunate victim.
Lynn Breeden was a part-time model who once posed for Playboy magazine. She worked here at a men's club called Number 5 Orange as a cocktail waitress.
A lot of her friends were able to tell us about her background. Unfortunately, I think she'd gone the cocaine route, the city of Vancouver, and I think she was well involved in the use of cocaine.
Lynn Breeden was last seen late Friday night, walking along Robson Street in Vancouver. Police learned that Breeden's former boyfriend lived on Robson Street in this apartment building. His name was Chris Paycock, and he was well known to police.
He was a local drug trafficker, was certainly one of the last persons to be seen with her.
During police questioning, Paycock admitted he was with Lynn Breeden for most of the night on the Friday in question. He said she stopped by his apartment. They had a few drinks, talked for a while, and ended up having sex. Afterwards, they went to Celebrities nightclub, and later to a small after-hours club. Paycock said Lynn was behaving badly, flirting with other men. and after an entire evening of it, he became angry.
We're leaving. Let's just stay. Back off, man. No, we're leaving. I get you high and you're going out with these guys. I don't listen. I said back off. We're leaving.
I'm not leaving this time. We're having a great time.
You're such trash.
I'm having a good time.
He left the club without her and said that was the last he saw of her.
In that case, it was a dead end, yes. He looked really good to begin with, but when we confirmed his alibi and his story, yes, it turned out to be a dead end as far as that he was concerned.
But detectives received an interesting tip from the manager of Lynn Breeden's bank. A woman had posed as Lynn Breeden, attempting to withdraw all of the funds from her account.
I got up to the counter and I asked to help her, and she signed a withdrawal slip for $4,000, basically what Lynn had in her account, and it wasn't Lynn.
Security photographs showed the imposter looking out the window, possibly at an accomplice standing outside. But glare from the sun hid the identity of whomever was outside. The woman left the bank quickly when her identity was questioned.
We went to our fraud squad and said, do you know this person? And we did all those investigative things in case this was a chronic fraud suspect and somehow, some way we could come up with a name through that avenue of investigation. That didn't give us an answer.
Police launched an all-out effort to find the woman who posed as Lynn Breeden. It was their only lead to the murderer. The local newspaper published a photograph of the woman who posed as Lynn Breeden at the bank and asked anyone who knew her to come forward. Within hours, an anonymous tip identified the woman in the photograph as Tanya Forrester.
Given that information, we went to her, told her what we was dealing with, and asked her for a cooperation and why she was in there taking attempting to take the money from the victim's account.
Tanya Forrester told police that she was given Lynn Breeden's wallet and identification by a man named Chris Cruz, who told her it was stolen. Together, they agreed to clean out her bank account before it was reported missing.
She was unaware at the time that that was the victim of a homicide's bank account.
Chris Cruz was an unusual character. He was a model and actor, a student at the University of British Columbia who was planning to attend medical school. But Chris Cruz also went by the name of Tony Devins, the stage name he used as a stripper and professional escort. He reportedly had a healthy appetite for cocaine. Cruz told police that he had been out on the night of Breeden's murder, first at the Love Affair nightclub, and later at the same after-hours club that Lynn Breeden and her boyfriend attended. Cruz said he only stayed for 20 minutes before leaving in a taxi cab to see a girlfriend. The next day, he said a friend offered him the contents of Lynn Breeden's purse, telling Cruz it had been stolen.
We asked him, can we search your car? He said, yes, we could. We asked him what kind of a car it was, and he gave us the description, gray Oldsmobile. We asked him where it was, and he said, well, it's not running very well. It's out at my grandmother's place in Surrey.
But Cruz didn't know that he had been under police surveillance. They knew he had driven his car to police headquarters for questioning and parked it right down the street.
Initially, you think, why is he lying? So the car must be playing a part in the lie. So we locked that up, and that was secured overnight.
When photographic experts reprocessed the bank photograph to remove the window glare from the sun, police could see the individual standing outside when Tanya Forrester attempted to withdraw Lynn Breeden's money. It was Chris Cruz. And when forensic detectives inspected Cruz's car, they found blood on the outside of the car and even more on the inside.
Inside the trunk, I think he was basically living out of the vehicle for some time. There was his own clothing, but there was evidence there that you could only hope for. in any homicide case.
Police also found a .22 caliber rifle, a 5-gallon gasoline container in the trunk, and a suit jacket Cruz was seen wearing at the After Hours Club. Inside the pocket, police found a Playboy bunny pendant stained with blood. It was similar to one Lynn Breeden wore in this photograph. Many items inside the car were covered with blood. The spare tire, clothing, a photo album, and a tire iron found in the back seat. In spite of all the evidence, police had a serious problem. They had no way of knowing to whom the blood in the car belonged.
Now, our difficulty in this case is what was it we were going to compare it to? The normal things that we would use from an autopsy and the toxicology exhibits were so badly damaged that the DNA exhibit from those toxicology exhibits was not possible.
If the police couldn't figure out a way to match the blood inside Cruz's car to Lynn Breeden, it was entirely possible that Chris Cruz would walk free. Police had a lot of circumstantial evidence linking Chris Cruz to Lynn Breeden. They found blood in his car, on his clothes, and they found hair and blood on a tire iron found in the back seat.
It was just incredible how much evidence we had, and it would be an absolute shame if the suspect had been successful, so successful in destroying the body that none of that evidence could be used in order to tie him into the crime.
The fire not only incinerated Lynn Breeden's body, but also any chance of a DNA profile. Her skin, blood, saliva, and hair follicles, all possible areas for DNA testing, had all been destroyed. Dr. David Sweet is a forensic odontologist who had been following the Breeden murder in the newspapers. He suggested that scientists try something which had never been attempted before, that they tried to harvest the genetic material from inside Breeden's teeth, from the tooth pulp, in order to generate a DNA profile.
They ran with the idea, released some evidence to me in the forms of some bones and teeth. I was particularly interested in the impacted wisdom teeth, or the teeth that were still embedded in the jawbone, both the upper jawbone and the lower jawbone. It was my sense that these teeth were more protected from the fire than the other tissues and the other teeth, because they were deeper in the core of the body, away from the potential heat source.
The pulp was sent to the forensics lab, along with samples of blood collected from Chris Cruz's car.
I never thought for a second that tooth pulp could be used, or any part of any tooth could be used for DNA testing.
Blood cells were extracted from the tooth pulp and treated with a special chemical cocktail, and the DNA floated free, a sticky bundle of complex molecules. Next, the DNA was cut into smaller pieces, marked with a radioactive dye, and placed in separate lanes on an electrophoretic gel, where it was subjected to an electric field. The separated fragments are then visualized on X-ray film, called an autoradiogram, which resembles a barcode. When scientists compared the blood DNA found in Cruz's trunk, on his jacket, and on the photo album, it matched the DNA profile of Lynn Breeden.
It was very clear. The match showed that the DNA typing profile from the various exhibits submitted to me matched that of the DNA typing profile from the tooth pulp from the victim.
Based on the forensic evidence, Chris Cruz was charged with the murder of Lynn Breeden. At the After Hours nightclub, Lynn Breeden and her boyfriend, Chris Paycook, got into an argument when she flirted with some other men she met there.
Get back off.
Following the argument, Paycook left the club alone. Witnesses said Lynn was looking for cocaine that night, and at some point made the acquaintance of Chris Cruz. There was some evidence that the two already knew one another. Both were models, frequented the same night spots, and reportedly shared an appetite for cocaine. Shortly after daybreak, they left the after-hours club together, and some sort of disagreement took place, possibly over payment for some drugs Cruz may have provided. As they drove home that morning, police believe their argument escalated. Cruz stopped the car, and the disagreement turned violent.
My money now!
In a rage, Cruz grabbed a tire iron from the trunk and struck Breeden on the head and face. As Lynn Breeden lay near death with a fractured skull, Cruz grabbed his .22 caliber rifle and shot her 3 times in the head. Cruz placed the body into the trunk and drove to the deserted parking lot, where he dumped the body inside a garbage bin and emptied a 5-gallon container of gasoline he kept in the trunk. No one saw the fire as it burned for hours shortly after daybreak on July 6, 1991.
According to the fire department, the fire was probably 1 gallon of gas away from a total cremation. And looking at the victim at the time of the discovery, you'd have to believe that it was close to a full cremation.
And without the scientific evidence, the remains might have gone unidentified and the blood in the car unmatched.
Absolutely, it made the case. It did the ultimate link up to all this evidence that we were so happy to find to our victim, the murder.
And the case broke new ground for forensic scientists, since it was the first time that DNA evidence from a tooth was used in a criminal case. Chris Cruz was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Lynn Breeden and sentenced to life in prison.
Lynn Breeden was a very beautiful girl, and a lot of people acknowledge that. In fact, there were a lot of areas where she could have gone and things that she could have done as a result of it. Unfortunately, she got caught up in a little bit of this cocaine problem, and the result was that it brought her to the circumstances that led to her death. Very tragic. Chris Cruz himself, good-looking man, a lot going for him. He had attended the university here in town, and he was doing what he could that way. So it was another spoiled life, really, by him being involved in what had taken place here. Again, as a result of the drug involvement. If you take away the drug, I don't believe any of this would have happened.
It was a typical Wednesday morning in the Snow household. Sue Snow was preparing for another long day as vice president at a local bank.
Morning, Mom. Morning, Haley. How you doing?
And her daughter Haley was running a little late, rushing to take a quick shower before heading off to school.
Well, I hope you know it.
Over the sounds of the running water, Haley couldn't hear when her mother collapsed. It was a tragedy, then a medical mystery, one which sent shockwaves throughout the world. Susan Snow was a successful banking executive and the mother of 2 young daughters. She had recently remarried and was well known in the small suburb of Seattle, Washington.
She was very well liked. She liked to flirt, I think, with men, and probably used it to her advantage. She was in the banking industry, and I think that she had a lot of clients that dealt with her bank because they liked Sue Snow and liked dealing with Sue Snow.
Sue Snow was only 40 years old and in perfect health on the day she collapsed.
I realized something was wrong. Her eyes were open and they were rolled sort of back, and her fingers were very stiff, and she looked terrified. She looked very scared.
Sue Snow was rushed to a nearby hospital unconscious and near death. She died shortly after arrival. Dr. Corinne Fligner performed the autopsy, attempting to identify the cause of death.
The initial part of the autopsy revealed what we would call no anatomic cause of death. That means that there wasn't a definite pathologic finding that could explain Ms. Snow's death.
But Dr. Fligner's assistant in the autopsy room noticed a tiny clue. It wasn't anything she could see. It was something she thought she smelled. When Janet Miller opened Sue Snow's chest cavity, she noticed the faint smell of bitter almonds. It was a clue that cyanide was present, and a clue that under different circumstances might have gone undetected.
It's just such a distinct odor. It's like when you're driving down the road and you smell skunk. That's a very distinct odor, and you say, oh, a skunk was near here. Something happened near here involving a skunk. It just leaves an impression in your brain that you don't forget.
Now, with the suspicion of cyanide poisoning, Sue Snow's blood sample was sent for a special test, one not usually performed in a routine autopsy. An acid solution separated the blood from any possible cyanide molecules. After mixing, the test tube was sealed with a special reactive paper and then heated. The paper on the vial turned blue, proof that Sue Snow had been poisoned with cyanide. Cyanide is one of the deadliest poisons because it kills the enzymes that transport oxygen throughout the body. Death occurs within minutes of ingestion, literally starving the body of oxygen. But how did Sue Snow ingest cyanide? It was her twin sister, Sarah, who made the initial discovery. On the day of Sue's funeral, Sarah looked for some headache medication in her sister's kitchen and found something suspicious.
Sue and I both took Excedrin tablets. When we got there, I went to the kitchen to get her Excedrin to take, and it was capsules, and she never took capsules.
Lab tests confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Cyanide was found in 9 Excedrin capsules in Sue Snow's kitchen. Sarah Webb came within inches of ingesting the tainted capsules herself. The family suspected that Sue's new husband, Paul Webking, put the cyanide in the Excedrin.
He was very uptight and very nervous and made crude jokes, it seems, occasionally, and it was just the way he was dealing with the situation, and it just rubbed me wrong. I was dealing with it differently.
Paul Webking had been married 3 times before and had been married to Sue Snow for just 6 months. He was a long-haul trucker with a hard, gruff demeanor and was not as financially successful as his wife. Shortly before their marriage, Sue discovered that Paul was still dating an old girlfriend.
Sue knew about it, and they had a lot of trouble over it. And finally he told Sue, well, I'm not going to see this girl anymore, let's get married. And they got married, and 6 months later, she's dead.
Paul Webking admitted that it was his idea to switch from headache tablets to capsules, but said he had nothing to do with the tampering of the capsules. The manufacturer of Excedrin capsules wasn't taking any chances. They issued an immediate recall of extra-strength Excedrin from all store shelves. health officials feared that the death of Sue Snow was not an isolated incident.
In Auburn, Washington, extra-strength Excedrin capsules are being pulled from the store shelves. This after authorities confirmed that a cyanide-laced capsule caused the death last week of a 40-year-old woman, Sue Snow.
When news reports of Sue Snow's death were broadcast throughout the country, one Seattle viewer, Stella Nickel, took more than a passing interest. Stella Nickel told police that her husband had taken some Excedrin capsules shortly before he died.
She called the King County Police and said that her husband had died a couple weeks earlier and that she had discovered that he had taken Excedrin from the same lot number as the Excedrin that had killed Sue Snow.
You have those capsules?
Yeah, sure do.
May I see them, please?
Sure.
A police detective visited Stella Nickel's home to pick up the bottles of Excedrin capsules Bruce Nickel had been using. Stella asked that the bottles be tested to determine whether cyanide was present.
It's just a shame about that woman.
Yes, it certainly was. Well, I assure you, we're checking every lead.
She also wanted the coroner to reopen her husband's case to test his blood samples for cyanide, a test which hadn't been performed during his autopsy. When Bruce Nickel's blood sample was analyzed, the reactive paper on the vial turned blue. Bruce Nickel died of cyanide poisoning, and cyanide-laced Excedrin capsules were discovered in the 2 bottles found in his home. Police continued to investigate their first suspect, Sue Snow's husband, Paul Webking.
He can be aggressive, and the fact that he remarried shortly after Sue had died, that was another thing that made the family, uncomfortable, and they wanted to blame him for whatever had happened.
Webking offered to take a lie detector test to clear his name. To the surprise of almost everyone, he passed.
There was enough circumstantial things pointing at Paul Webking that I personally was a little surprised when he took a polygraph examination that was administered by the FBI and passed it and was eliminated as a suspect.
With Webking now cleared, authorities feared they had a random killer on their hands, some sort of pharmaceutical terrorist. All of the Excedrin capsules removed from store shelves were analyzed with an X-ray machine. Since cyanide is more dense than pain reliever, tainted capsules show up as dark areas inside the bottle. 2 more bottles of cyanide-laced pain reliever were found on store shelves. Newspapers and television stations throughout the world reported the discovery of the tainted capsules in Seattle. The FBI feared that this case would wind up like the Chicago Tylenol murders just a few years earlier, a case which has never been solved. All of the tainted Excedrin capsules were sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. Each tainted capsule contained 700 milligrams of cyanide, 4 times more than a lethal dose. The FBI also found something else inside the capsules, some mysterious green crystals mixed in with the cyanide. The green crystals were analyzed using a mass spectrometer, a device which can identify the exact chemical components of an unknown sample. After the crystals were liquefied, a beam of high-energy electrons collided with the molecules, breaking them down into their smallest possible units. This produces a fingerprint of every identifiable substance in the crystals. The green crystals were made up of 4 common chemicals: atrazine, diclone, monuron, and simazine. 2 of these chemicals are used to kill algae in fish aquariums. An FBI chemist visited all of the fish stores near his home, hoping to find a commercially produced algicide with the same 4 compounds.
Do you have any algicide? Sure. This aisle right here, other side of the big fish tank.
After looking through hundreds of products, one algicide in particular caught his eye. The product was called Algae Destroyer, and was sold in green speckled tablets. The product had the same 4 compounds in the exact same amount as the green crystals found in the cyanide. The FBI had no idea why a fish algicide would be in the cyanide, but reported this discovery to Seattle authorities. One of the detectives in Seattle recalled an interesting coincidence. When he visited Stella Nichols' home to pick up the Excedrin capsules, he remembered seeing an aquarium prominently displayed in her living room. Was it possible that Stella Nichols played some role in the death of her husband and in the death of Sue Snow? The FBI visited 57 different fish and pet stores near Stella Nichols' home, armed with a photo montage which included Stella's picture. Tom Noonan recognized Stella Nichols' photograph and recalled selling her the same algae destroyer product.
The FBI was making inquiries if I'd ever remember selling her a certain product, and I did. And I told them, just like I told her and anybody else that purchased this product, when they would take it home to crush it up to make it more effective, because a lot of times when you put it in the aquarium it would not dissolve, it would remain rather inert in the tank and not effectively break down and kill the algae that was inside the fish tank.
I think that they were very suspicious of her, and they knew that somehow Stella and her circle was linked to what happened to Sue Snow and to what happened to Bruce.
Bruce Nichols' life insurance policies revealed that Stella would receive $100,000 extra if the death of her husband was accidental.
Stella ever say anything about them having any money problems? Well, yes, because she was going to school and not working there for a while, and it was getting pretty tight.
In fact, the Nichols were in serious financial trouble and had recently received a final delinquency notice on their home mortgage and on some other loans. Just 5 days before Bruce Nichols' death, Stella Nichols wrote a series of letters to her creditors.
Dear sirs, I know that I am tremendously overdue with my payments. There is a good reason for it. I'm having marital problems and they are about solved. Bruce is no longer involved. I will pay you at least $500 per month. Stella Nichols.
When FBI handwriting expert Lee Wagoner studied the life insurance documents, he noticed something suspicious. Bruce Nichols' signature on the life insurance application differed from his known signature samples. The N and K were different from his normal signature.
The initial stroke of the N begins about halfway up that N, whereas Bruce's N begins at the top of that N. The final stroke on the signature in question ends up turning to the right below the baseline of writing in the signature in question. It does not in the genuine signatures of Bruce.
But it was consistent with the way Stella Nichols signed her name. Investigators believed that Stella forged her husband's signature on the insurance applications. But money wasn't the only possible motive. Stella and Bruce Nichols had always been a very social couple, regularly visiting bars and night spots with friends. But all of that changed after Bruce entered an alcoholism treatment program and stopped drinking altogether.
After a period of time, it got to her. You know, it wasn't the life that she envisioned, because even though she was 42 or 43 years old, she saw herself as a hot babe still. She wanted to be seen and get out there, and Bruce held her back.
She spent a lot of time in bars, you know, driving around, flirting with different men and that kind of thing. She had a boyfriend. You know, she wasn't, she didn't paint a picture of being real dedicated to her husband.
The FBI interviewed Cindy and told her about the circumstantial evidence they had against her mother.
Cindy broke down and she said, Well, yes, my mom did kill Bruce. I know for sure that she did because we had talked about it.
Cindy also told the FBI that her mother visited the library to research the subject of poisons. Records at the Auburn Public Library revealed that Stella signed out a book entitled Deadly Harvest, which lists various sources and methods of poisoning. Stella's fingerprints were found all over the sections dealing with cyanide poisoning, and were also found on the pages of various encyclopedia describing cyanide. Investigators now had enough circumstantial evidence to charge Stella Nickell with the murder of her husband. And the FBI discovered why Stella Nickell murdered Sue Snow, a woman she didn't know. By the spring of 1986, Stella Nickell had grown tired of her money problems and what she considered to be a boring existence with her husband, Bruce. She hatched a plan to murder her husband and collect on his life insurance policies, which would pay $100,000 extra if his death was accidental. Her library research led her to choose cyanide, a highly toxic salt. But Stella was careless. She ground the cyanide in the same bowl she used earlier to grind the algicide tablets for her aquarium, but she neglected to wash the bowl before grinding the cyanide. She never suspected that the tiny green algicide crystals would mix with the cyanide and lead to her capture. After putting the cyanide into the headache capsules, she placed the bottle among her husband's other medications. Bruce suffered from chronic headaches and took pain relievers almost every day. After Bruce Nickell's death, the coroner mistakenly ruled that it was due to natural causes, a mistake which deprived Stella of an additional $100,000 of life insurance money. Stella needed an excuse, some reason to have her husband's autopsy tissues re-examined. So she decided to poison someone else, to create the impression that a cyanide murderer was on the loose. She placed 3 more bottles of cyanide-laced pain reliever on the shelves of 2 stores near her home. Someone in the Snow household purchased one of those bottles.
You know, that sister of yours didn't get home till this morning.
Sue Snow took 2 capsules from that bottle one morning before work.
I don't know what I'm going to do with her.
And died a short time later. When the cyanide was discovered during Sue Snow's autopsy and traced to the Excedrin capsules in her home, Stella Nickell had the excuse she needed to ask that her husband's case be reopened. She got away with murder once and tried to get away with it a second time. When the FBI identified the tiny green crystals in the cyanide as algae destroyer and located a fish store near Stella Nickell's home, which sold her the product, the library books and forged life insurance policies sealed the case against her. The FBI never found the cyanide, the algae destroyer tablets, or the bowl used to mix the cyanide in Stella Nickell's home. After a 4-week trial, one in which her own daughter testified against her, Stella Nickell was convicted of 2 counts of murder and was sentenced to 90 years in prison.
It's hard for me to think that there are people out there who can do something like that without thinking about what kind of repercussions there are on other people. It's just amazing to me that there are people that selfish to take a life. And not only my mother's, but her husband's. I mean, that's almost more unimaginable to me than her killing a perfect stranger such as my mom, but that she would kill her own husband for that.
I see you have your Breakfast of Champions there with you.
Janet McDermott planned to stop by her office only briefly on the morning of October 15, 1985.
Have a nice day, Steve.
She had a number of business appointments around Salt Lake City that day. Moments later, an explosion rocked the building, killing her colleague who worked next door. Science uncovered a tale of forgery, fraud, and murder. The explosion occurred on the 6th floor of the historic Judge Building in downtown Salt Lake City. Killed in the blast was 31-year-old Steve Christensen, a financial consultant who left behind his wife Terry and a young family.
He was lying in the doorway of his office, and he was lying on his right side, burn marks on his face, smoke marks, and blood.
The explosion ripped the door off its hinges, and the location of the debris told investigators that the blast occurred directly in front of Steve Christensen's office door.
You could tell the precise location where the bomb exploded. Match that with the autopsy, and we could tell where the bomb was when it exploded because of its shearing power, breaking bones, going through skin, things of that nature.
Small pieces of batteries and fragments of pipe were found in the hallway as well. Many of the parts had the name Tandy imprinted, a brand sold exclusively in Radio Shack electronic stores. All of the fragments were collected and pieced back together, revealing that the explosion was caused by a pipe bomb. This is a replica of the type which was used. But who wanted to kill Steve Christensen, and why? Christensen had recently resigned his job as Vice President of Consolidated Financial Services, or CFS, a real estate investment company which was undergoing serious financial difficulties. Many clients had lost large sums of money, and some were alleging fraud. In the debris, police discovered a piece of brown wrapping paper with Christensen's first name written in thick black marker. Bruce Passy had a jewelry business a few floors below Steve Christensen's office. He told police he noticed something unusual in the elevator that morning.
I told him that I saw a box this morning that had the name Steve Christensen, and that my father and I went up an elevator with the gentleman holding this box.
Janet McDermott recalled seeing the package in the hallway directly in front of Steve Christensen's office door. A motion-sensitive mercury switch was found in the debris, an indication that the bomb was activated by tilting the package. Motion-sensitive bombs are almost always delivered by the bombers themselves, so they can be delivered without going off. Bruce Passy described the delivery man as a white male about 5 feet 8 inches tall with medium brown hair.
Once he came in, I mean, he was wearing a high school leather jacket without the letter on it, but it had the colors of a leather jacket.
I was just very concerned for the business community and that other people might be involved on a revenge type situation, whether it be for investments or gone bad or something similar to that. And I was worried who would be the next victim.
That worry became reality just 2 hours later. 2 hours after the bombing which killed Steve Christensen, there was another explosion across town. This time, the victim was 50-year-old Kathy Sheets. Her husband, Gary, was the former business partner of Steve Christensen.
It was real devastating to have your mother killed on your front doorstep. You feel that you're safe in your home and that it's okay, and to have something like that happen really shattered your faith that things are okay.
Once again, the fragments recovered at the scene were consistent with a pipe bomb. Police found scraps of brown paper near the blast with the name of the victim's husband, Gary Sheets.
the time I got to the second scene, I already knew what I was looking for, if there were going to be similarities. Within 25 minutes, I had found the similarities. Within 5 hours, I found a component. That component was a very small piece of a mercury switch.
A mercury switch was found at the Christensen bomb site as well. A mercury switch is a glass ball filled with mercury, a liquid metal. When the mercury is tilted, it completes the electrical circuit, triggering the explosion.
We had a lot of similarities, and they would include the cardboard container, the types of tape, more than one type, the size of the pipe, that which includes the diameter and the length, the explosive inside, the type of explosives inside.
Gunpowder from both bomb sites were sent to the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms lab for analysis. They store samples of every known gunpowder manufactured. The particles of gunpowder from the pipe bombs were placed on a profile projector, which measures the size and shape of the granules. When this information was entered into a computer database, the gunpowder was identified as Hercules Bullseye brand. The same type was used in both bombs. Since Radio Shack batteries and electrical components were found at both bomb sites, detectives checked all of the Radio Shack stores in the Salt Lake City area. Records showed that an individual by the name of Mike Hansen had recently purchased the same components from this Radio Shack store in Holiday, Utah. The store had an address for Mike Hansen, but it was a vacant lot, and detectives suspected that the name was an alias. The only individual who reported seeing anything suspicious at the Sheets' home was a 13-year-old neighbor, Aaron Teplick. He told police he saw a tan Toyota minivan turn into the Sheets' driveway around midnight, the night before the bombing. He said the van drove out of the Sheets' driveway a few minutes later, but the boy could offer no description of the driver.
I think we have a serial bomber out there. What was entering into my mind was, how soon are we going to have another bombing?
It was a very short wait. While investigators were sifting through the rubble of the bombings which killed Steve Christensen and Kathy Sheets, there was a third explosion the very next day. This time, it happened in a parked car in downtown Salt Lake City. The victim was 30-year-old Mark Hoffman, a rare documents dealer. Unlike the other two victims, Hoffman survived the blast. Hoffman's injuries were severe. The explosion blew off the tips of 2 fingers. A portion of his right kneecap was missing, and a piece of metal was embedded in his knee.
Mark Hoffman said that he pulled open the door and the package fell from the seat of the car onto the floorboard of the car, at which time it exploded and he was injured.
Mark Hoffman had no connection with the CFS Corporation. He was a well-known and respected rare documents dealer who specialized in early Mormon currency and documents. But Mark Hoffman and Steve Christensen knew one another. Christensen was a collector of rare books and documents and had purchased some items from Hoffman over the years. One thing detectives knew: the bombs which killed Steve Christensen, Kathy Sheets, and seriously injured Mark Hoffman were all made by the same individual. They also knew that evidence inside Mark Hoffman's car was inconsistent with what he told police. Hoffman said someone placed a package on the seat of his car, and when he opened the car door, the package fell onto the floor and exploded. But when a pipe bomb explodes, the end caps blow out in a straight line. One of the end caps blew a hole through the side door on the passenger side. The other end cap was found in Mark Hoffman's knee. This important detail told investigators that the bomb did not explode on the floor of the car, as Hoffman indicated.
Didn't line up with the exploding bomb. We can't change that because of the holes in the vehicle. That's a true. It's now taking the injured pieces of the individual, putting them so they come in contact with the bomb.
The injury to Hoffman's knee indicated that his right knee was on the driver's seat at the time of the explosion. And the injuries to Hoffman's fingers indicated that he had been touching the bomb when it exploded.
So now we have an injured hand, an injured leg, and I know the attitude the pipe bomb was in. I also know that he has uninjured body parts. The other leg is in very good shape. There's not even any burn damage. So I have part of him outside the car, part of him inside the car.
The evidence revealed that the bomb exploded over the center console, in between the two front seats, and not on the floor of the vehicle, as Hoffman indicated. When police searched Mark Hoffman's home, they found a high school letter jacket with the letter missing, similar to the one Bruce Passy saw on the delivery man in the elevator on the morning of Steve Christensen's murder. Even more alarming, police discovered that Hoffman owned a tan-colored Toyota minivan similar to the one the teenage boy saw driving into the Sheets driveway the night before the bombing. Inside Hoffman's van, police discovered a single flake of gunpowder. Tests revealed that it was Hercules bullseye gunpowder, the same type used in making the pipe bombs.
We had no idea why Mark Hoffman, if he were the perpetrator, would kill a close associate and friend of his, Steve Christensen. And for all we knew, he didn't even know Kathleen Sheets.
Hoffman told police that he was a victim and even took a lie detector test to prove his innocence.
We've had him take a polygraph and he passed with flying colors. Not even close. He passed with a high number saying that he was not deceptive and that he did not do the bombings.
Despite the polygraph results, investigators were suspicious of Mark Hoffman since the scientific evidence was inconsistent with his description of the bombing. On the day of Steve Christensen's murder, Mark Hoffman was scheduled to meet with Mormon church officials to discuss some early Mormon documents he was selling known as the McClellan Collection. Steve Christensen was active in the Mormon church and was asked to attend that meeting in order to certify that the documents were authentic.
As I was inquiring about who examined the documents, it was my feeling it had never been examined forensically.
George Throckmorton was asked to do just that, to use scientific forensic methods to find out whether some of the world's leading experts had been fooled. Despite the fact that Mark Hoffman passed a lie detector test, bomb experts from the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms were convinced that Mark Hoffman was inside his automobile, possibly arming the bomb when it accidentally exploded. The scientific evidence supported their theory, but missing was a motive.
How you prove Mark Hoffman was a murderer is you first proved that he was a con man, that his whole life was based upon fraud.
George Throckmorton is a forensic document examiner who was asked to examine the rare documents Mark Hoffman had sold over the years. He compared them to other rare documents the Mormon Church had in its vault from the same time period which Hoffman had nothing to do with. Under ultraviolet light, many of the documents Hoffman sold turned blue. This was not the case with the documents the Mormon Church obtained from other sources. Under a microscope, Throckmorton noticed that the ink on Hoffman's documents ran in one direction. In the other documents, the ink was absorbed by the paper uniformly, spreading in all directions. And Throckmorton discovered microscopic cracks in the ink on the documents Hoffman uncovered. Throckmorton calls it alligatoring, and there was none of this in any of the other documents.
At this point, it made us say something's wrong, but we don't know what. Why are Hoffman's documents different than the other documents?
When Mark Hoffman's home was searched following the bombings, police discovered a book which contained a recipe for iron galotanic ink, an ink that was common in the 1800s. Throckmorton made a batch of that ink and wrote with it on some paper. He then applied an ammonia solution which is known to age paper. The test document displayed the same blue haze under ultraviolet light. And when it was hung to dry, the ink ran in one direction and exhibited the same alligatoring condition as the Hoffman documents. Finally, Throckmorton turned his attention to the Oath of a Freeman, believed to be the oldest printed document in the United States. It was a document Mark Hoffman said he purchased in a used bookstore and was valued at over $1 million. It had been authenticated by both the Library of Congress and the FBI. When Throckmorton looked at it closely, he found a curious anomaly. There was a tiny flaw in the letter M.
That microscopic flaw was not caused by old age, was not caused by a printing problem. It was caused through the photographic process. Therefore, that document had to go through that photographic process.
The flaw looked like emulsion on a photographic negative. This modern printing method did not exist in 1638 when the Oath of a Freeman was allegedly written.
Therefore, it had to be counterfeit.
Inside Hoffman's home, police discovered a receipt from a printing company in Utah. It was for a printing plate for the Oath of a Freeman document. The printing company thought the plate was used to print facsimiles. In fact, it was. Hoffman took the plate, added the old ink recipe and a piece of old paper to create the forgery, and offered it for sale as an original. On the receipt was the name Mike Hansen, but it included Mark Hoffman's telephone number. It was the same name used at the Radio Shack store to purchase the bomb components. Throckmorton's forensic document examination proved that Hoffman was a fraud and a forger. Prosecutors believed that Steve Christensen was on to Mark Hoffman and was about to expose him as a liar and possibly a fraud. Hoffman sensed this and decided to murder Steve Christensen with a pipe bomb. But Hoffman wanted Christensen's murder to appear to be business-related, so he delivered a diversionary bomb to Christensen's former business partner, Gary Sheets. The boy living across the street saw a van similar to Hoffman's pull into the Sheets' driveway around midnight. Hoffman placed the pipe bomb package on the front walkway to the Sheets' home. The next morning, Hoffman delivered the primary bomb to Steve Christensen's office building. It was packed with more than 100 masonry nails, leaving no doubt that its intent was to kill, not injure.
And I have to...
The jewelry store owner identified Mark Hoffman as the man wearing the leather jacket in the elevator. He was carrying a package addressed to Steve Christensen. Hoffman left the package outside Christensen's office door. It was armed with a motion-sensitive mercury switch set to explode when tilted at a 45-degree angle.
Have a good day, Steve.
Steve Christensen picked up the package when he arrived for work. Two hours later, Kathy Sheets noticed the package left outside her home, addressed to her husband, Gary. Mark Hoffman was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder and for theft by deception for selling forged documents. Hoffman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was convicted. A parole board recommended that he spend the rest of his life in prison. Ironically, many of Hoffman's forgeries are still on the market.
Every single document that I looked at had been forged or manipulated in some way to make it valuable. And I looked at over 600 of his documents. Every single one of them was forged. He never found a single genuine document ever.
And the deception turned a mild-mannered documents dealer into a killer.
I think Mark is probably the most evil of people that I've worked with. Serial bombers, by and large, are much more evil. They don't want to just hurt you. They want to continue to hurt many people.
And how common is it for a bomber to blow himself up when handling one of his own bombs?
Not common enough.
After a day of fishing in a small, quiet village in Switzerland, a teenage boy did not return home as planned. The investigation revealed some important microscopic evidence in the water near where he was last seen. It was the only forensic evidence detectives had. Late in the afternoon of August 4th, 1993, in the small Swiss village of Neu-Paradis, 13-year-old Dario Ciccolecchia left his home to go fishing in a nearby creek. As night fell on the town, Dario had not returned home, and his mother called the police to report her son missing.
When we found the bike and his clothing, we concluded that he had last been fishing there. Where and with whom he could have left the place, we had no idea.
2 days passed, and the search intensified with more than 100 policemen patrolling the area with search dogs. A missing person poster aired on local television, and newspapers asked, "Where is Dario?" As time passed, people feared the worst.
To us, there were clear indications that a crime had taken place because of the objects found, his bike and his trunks.
Search teams meticulously combed the field next to the creek where Dario's swim trunks and fishing pole had been found. Farther downstream, police found Dario's T-shirt on the bank. A dam was placed in the creek in order to search the muddy bottom for evidence. Many items were discovered, but nothing that could be linked to the missing boy. 2 nights after Dario was reported missing, 2 women were walking a dog along a field path near Switzerland's border with Germany. They saw what appeared to be blood. Just a few feet away, in a nearby cornfield, lay the naked body of a young man.
When I got the message from these two women, we immediately sent a police officer to check the site. When he reported that the body was that of a young man, we realized that it might be Dario.
The body was positively identified as Dario Cicalechia. He had been sexually mutilated.
I certainly will never forget this all of my life, that terrible sight. It was quite obvious from the beginning that it was a sex crime. This could be seen from the injuries. There were cuts and bruises also in the genital area.
When the medical examiner arrived at the scene, he concluded that the cuts on the body were consistent with a pocket knife, but were made sometime after the boy was dead.
I found on the body a lot of long cuts, side by side, and this helped me to think that the boy did not move during the cuts were made. And on the other hand, there were no defensive wounds.
Although blood had been found near the body, Dr. Weiler believed it wasn't enough blood to indicate that the boy's heart was still pumping when the mutilation took place.
When there is no heart action and no circulation in the body, there is no possibility to bleed very much.
With no evidence of a struggle, police suspected that Dario had been murdered somewhere else and the body transported to the cornfield. Police found Dario's sneakers in the cornfield, but they did not find the knife used in the mutilation.
We were greatly alarmed. Such crimes are frequently repeated if the killer is still at large. We therefore started immediately with a very thorough search of the environment.
Police could find no foreign hair, fibers, or semen, but Dr. Weiler swabbed the inside of Dario's mouth for possible forensic evidence. When he analyzed that sample, he discovered some microscopic evidence. It was a discovery that would change the course of the investigation and launch a new era in crime science. After Dario Cicalechia's mutilated body was found lying in a cornfield, Dr. Daniel Weiler analyzed the forensic evidence from Dario's mouth. Something under the microscope caught his attention. He found what are called diatoms. Diatoms are a type of algae, microscopic organisms that live mostly in the sea, in ponds, lakes, and streams. They can also be found on moist rocks, even in mud and soil. These tiny organisms are the most diverse of all algae. Globally, they account for approximately 25% of all photosynthesis. There are about 16,000 different species of diatoms worldwide, about 3,000 species in Switzerland alone. Diatoms can tell scientists about past environmental conditions in fresh water and marine environments as long ago as tens of thousands of years. And in the case of Dario Cicalechia, Dr. Weiler hoped that the diatoms found in his body would reveal something about his murder.
I was absolutely sure that this boy was drowned. In the lungs, I found a lot of mud. And this helped me to see that he has been in water with a lot of mud. So it can't be a very deep lake or something like that. It must be a creek or a small river or something like that.
Diatoms were also found on Dario's sneakers, which were in the cornfield near his body. The next step was to see if the diatoms in Dario's lungs and on his sneakers could help determine the exact body of water where Dario had been murdered. To find out, Dr. Weiler called on the expertise of Dr. Joachim Hürlimann, a biologist who specializes in the study of diatoms.
You can look to the diatoms in the lung and you see the species, and the species give you information about the type of river or lake, the water quality.
Dr. Hurleman was asked to analyze the diatom populations in Dario's lungs and sneakers, as well as those found in water samples from the region. If he could find significant similarities, investigators would know the exact location of his murder.
If you have a high similarity, you know that the two samples must come from the same place.
But with as many as 3,000 different species of diatoms in Switzerland alone, Dr. Hurleman would have to test water samples from the nearby bodies of water to make an accurate comparison.
To be very sure that there is no other pond or river or creek which has the similar or the same diatom community. So if you look to other water bodies and you won't find the communities, then you are quite sure that this special place was the place of the drowning.
Water samples were collected from the surrounding bodies of water, including the Rhine River, which flows between the creek and the cornfield where Dario's body had been found. The water samples were treated with acids to kill any organic matter in the diatoms, leaving their glass-like skeletal remains, a necessary step in identification according to species. Under the microscope, Dr. Hurleman compared the diatom populations found in Dario's lungs and on his sneakers to the thousands of known species in his reference journals. He found one dominant species. The diatoms were identified as Fragillaria pinnata, a freshwater species usually found attached to sand grains in slowly moving water. The next step was for Dr. Hurleman to count and identify the diatom populations from the various water samples using an elaborate chart. It was a tedious process, but eventually he found one body of water which had as its dominant species Fragillaria pinnata, the same dominant species found in Dario's lungs and on his sneakers. It was from a water sample taken from the creek just a few feet away from where Dario's bicycle was found. This discovery led Dr. Hurleman to one conclusion.
We can say that the diatoms found in the lungs of Dario must be from the same place we have taken samples from the creek.
Was it possible that the diatom evidence could tell investigators more than simply where Dario was murdered? Could the diatoms lead investigators to the killer? Armed with the diatom evidence found inside Dario Cicallecchia's lungs and on his sneakers, police concluded that he had been forcefully drowned in the creek where he had been fishing, before being mutilated and dumped in the cornfield. The question now, who murdered Dario? And how was the body transported to the cornfield a few kilometers away? Police questioned friends and acquaintances of the victim.
Wir haben über 200 Personen.
We questioned about 200 persons both in Switzerland and Germany. Of course, the family were also investigated, as it is always done in such cases. Also, in case no responsible person is found, to clear the family that no suspicions remain with them.
With no strong leads or suspects, Swiss police informed Interpol of the case. Interpol is an international agency headquartered in France that shares information about criminal investigations with 178 nations who are members of the network.
As the body was found so close to the border, it was possible that the murderer might have come from or gone to a foreign country. It was a difficult case. Interpol was also informed of the case.
3 months after the murder of Dario Cicallecchia, Interpol notified Swiss police of a possible lead. A man had been arrested in France for sexually assaulting a hitchhiker and trying to kill him. He was identified as 35-year-old Roland Keebler, a psychiatric nurse who was divorced and the father of a 5-year-old girl. What caught Interpol's attention was the fact that Keebler lived in Switzerland, not far from the village where Dario Ciccolecchia was murdered. When Dr. Weiler heard of Roland Keebler's arrest, he suggested something unusual. He told the Swiss police to examine Keebler's car.
The car is still in Switzerland. So I asked the police whether it's possible to get the pedals of the car and the carpet in the trunk, to bring all that stuff to Dr. Hürlimann.
It was clear that the people who has done this drowning, that he must have the items on his shoes, on his clothes, or in his car.
Forensic scientists collected microscopic debris from inside Keebler's car, including material from both the gas and brake pedals, the carpet in the passenger compartment, and the carpet from the trunk. When Dr. Hürlimann analyzed those samples under a microscope, he made a surprising discovery. He found diatoms. They were found on both the gas and brake pedals, in the carpet under the pedals, and in the carpet in the trunk. When he analyzed the diatoms found in the car, he discovered they were Fragillaria pinnata, the same dominant species found in Dario's lungs, on his sneakers, and in the creek. With 3,000 different species of diatoms in Switzerland, the similarities in the diatom evidence was significant.
We know now that the material found in the car must come or is similar to the one of the lung of Dario and to the material found in the creek.
Armed with this microscopic evidence, Swiss police confronted Roland Keebler. He denied he had anything to do with Dario's murder and said he only knew about the crime from what he read in the newspapers. But during questioning, Keebler revealed details of Dario's wounds, details which had never been reported in the newspapers. Roland Keebler knew too much. When confronted with the discrepancy, Roland Keebler confessed to the murder of Dario Ciccolecchia. A picture now emerged of what took place at the creek the day Dario disappeared, and how his killer left behind a microscopic trail of evidence. During police interrogation, Roland Keebler confessed to both the murder and mutilation of Dario Ciccolecchia and his long-standing sexual fantasies about young boys.
He is, in simple terms, a pedophile, and he has suppressed his homosexual tendencies for years. And when he lived his fantasies, he had to kill the victim in order to keep a secret.
On August 4th, 1993, Dario rode his bicycle to the creek near his home for an afternoon of fishing. He left his bike near the main road and headed down to the water. Roland Keebler was on vacation and had been drinking heavily when he drove in the area where Dario was fishing. Keebler spotted Dario's bike and told police just knowing a young boy was in the area excited him greatly. Keebler parked his car and walked to where Dario was fishing.
No, Nick.
After a brief conversation, Keebler approached Dario again. He attacked the young boy, pushing him into the water, forced him to undress, and sexually molested him. Then Keebler forced Dario's head under the water into the mud of the stream bed. With his knee between Dario's shoulder blades, he kept the boy submerged until the struggling stopped. Keebler decided not to leave the body at the scene of the crime. Instead, he placed the boy's body into the trunk of his car and left for a social engagement with his ex-wife. Little did Keebler realize he had left behind a trail of evidence, microscopic single-cell evidence, which would link him to the scene of the crime. From the moment Keebler pushed his victim into the creek, microscopic diatoms in the water attached themselves to the soles of his shoes, and diatoms in the water flooded Dario's mouth and lungs when he was forcefully drowned. Keebler transferred those diatoms from his shoes to the pedals of his car when he drove away. And diatoms from Dario's mouth would later seep onto the carpet in the trunk in which he was transported to the cornfield. Dr. Weiler's discovery of the diatoms and Dr. Hurleman's species identification in the laboratory were essential elements in tracking down a vicious killer. Roland Keebler had silenced his victim, but the diatom evidence spoke volumes.
I am proud that I found these diatoms. It was a very, very good feeling for me to have found a scientific way to prove something which was very important, to find a murder.
We know that we didn't make big mistakes or errors in the determination or in the preparation of all the samples. So it was, at this moment, it was a good feeling, of course.
Dieser Fall wird darum auch
This case therefore became sort of a model case. Also worldwide and particularly in Switzerland, it had never been done in this way before. We were pioneers, and we certainly hope that it will be possible to solve other cases in the same way for the future.
Roland Keebler confessed not only to the murder of Dario Cicolecchia, but also admitted killing another boy in the same area of Switzerland 10 years earlier. Keebler was convicted of both crimes and was sentenced to life in prison. Candles burned near the creek where Dario died, a shrine built by villagers to keep Dario's memory alive. And in a nearby churchyard where Dario is buried, his sculpture reminds visitors of the gentle, innocent child who died too soon.
Whenever children are the victims of violent crimes, it's much, much worse. And this must be the same all over the world.
Patient Chad Shelton is a 74-centimeter long white male infant.
When an 11-month-old baby died under mysterious circumstances, the autopsy samples provided few clues. But the pathologist noticed something suspicious.
The liver is diffusely yellowed, showing early signs of necrosis, which is highly unusual for a child of this age.
He had never seen anything like it.
Tissue samples will be sent to the lab for further testing.
Sally and Bruce Shelton lived in the quiet Midwestern town of Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha had many of the benefits of life in a large city with little of the crime and violence of other cities its size. The Sheltons had been married for about 2 years. Sally worked for an insurance company. Bruce was a television repairman. Most of their free time was spent with their 11-month-old son, Chad, whom they adored.
He was a big, full baby, big hands, big feet, like his daddy. He looked a lot like his daddy, but yet he had some features of his mama. Never sick. He was the real healthy baby and a very sweet little baby.
On Sunday morning, September 10th, 1978, Sally and Bruce had a full day planned, shopping, running errands, and cleaning the carpets in their home.
They had already been cleaning the house and preparing it for some new furniture. You know, they had money, but they were trying to buy a piece at a time, just like any family that's starting off. So that day they were going to a furniture store to get new lamps to spiffy up the apartment.
After furniture shopping, they visited Sally's sister at a small family gathering, attended a birthday party, and stopped for tacos at a drive-through Mexican restaurant. Later that night, 11-month-old Chad became ill. He was pale, lethargic, and had vomiting so severe, his parents said his entire body shook. He was rushed to the Emmanuel Medical Center.
This is little Chad.
Linda Dietrich was the nurse on duty. Within hours, Chad was bleeding from every orifice.
I was terribly alarmed. He looked like he was dying in front of me, like he was just going to die in front of me.
Doctors ordered a full range of blood tests. Chad's platelet count was 19,000, far below the norm of 140,000, and a blood sugar level of 11, an indication of serious liver failure.
Blood was coming out of the corner of his eyes, the corner of his nose, the corner of his mouth. Every pore had little bitty blood just barely seeping out, all over him. It was horrible to see something like that.
Early the next morning, Chad Shelton's heart rate dropped to 46 beats per minute, then dropped even further. Doctors and nurses worked feverishly to revive him without success. Just 48 hours after being admitted to the hospital, Chad Shelton died.
It was terrible. It was really a pretty baby. That baby just started life, and God took him.
A few hours later, another patient was admitted to the hospital with the same symptoms. This time, it was a 25-year-old truck driver.
Something is terribly, terribly wrong here. These are two healthy people, and now we have a little baby that's dead, and we have a 25-year-old man that's dying, and we don't know what's wrong with him.
Whatever had killed Chad Shelton, doctors now feared it was spreading. 25-year-old Dwayne Johnson was painting the exterior of his house when he first started to feel sick. He had a headache, muscle pain, chills, diarrhea, and vomiting. He also developed a severe nosebleed. He was taken by ambulance to Emmanuel Medical Center, the same hospital that treated Chad Shelton.
He was very sick, and he was obviously bleeding into many cutaneous surfaces, i.e. skin, and probably bleeding and oozing into many internal organs.
A few hours later, Dwayne Johnson died. It was Linda Dietrich, Chad Shelton's nurse, who first discovered an alarming coincidence. Dwayne Johnson was Chad Shelton's uncle.
My God, what is going on here? What is killing these people? What do we have here? Do we have an infectious disease?
Is this a new type of virus? Is this one that we didn't understand? Was anybody else going to catch it?
Soon, there were more cases. Chad's parents, Bruce and Sally, also had some vomiting. Dwayne Johnson's daughter, Sherry, was also sick and was admitted to the hospital. health officials held an emergency meeting to identify the cause of the mysterious outbreak, and they called in the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Renata Kimbrough was the CDC toxicologist assigned to the investigation. She knew from the autopsy results that whatever killed these two individuals did so without leaving a trace and affected only the liver.
The people didn't have fever. Normally, if you have a very rapid onset of an infectious disease, you usually have fever, often very high, and these people didn't have that.
Health officials frantically searched for clues. Was it a chemical in the shampoo Chad's parents used on their carpets? Or was it the Mexican food from the drive-in restaurant? Chad's mother said the tacos didn't taste right. Dwayne Johnson had been painting his house. Was it something in the paint or the fumes? During the course of their investigation, health officials discovered that Chad Shelton and Dwayne Johnson were together one day, about a week before they died. It was at a family gathering at Dwayne Johnson's home. The other family members who developed symptoms were there too.
Obviously, water samples were taken, insulation samples were taken, soil samples were taken, paint scrapings were taken. We took everything that could possibly have had an effect on this family.
A window air conditioner in Johnson's home was missing its filter and sat beneath the tree used by roosting birds. Health officials tested the soil for Histoplasma capsulatum, a yeast-like fungus caused by contaminated bird feces. They also discovered that lemonade had been served at the family gathering at the Johnson home. Everyone who drank the lemonade got sick. The three who did not stayed well. Unfortunately, the lemonade was gone, and the lemonade pitcher had been washed. Tests on the tap water, the lemonade mix, and sugar used to make the lemonade were all negative. And the soil outside the Johnsons' home did not contain the fungus from contaminated bird feces. Sherry Johnson, Dwayne's daughter, survived her brush with the mysterious illness thanks to a blood transfusion, but she suffered serious liver damage. As Dr. Kimbrough continued to analyze the autopsy slides, she was baffled. She had never seen such damage to human liver tissue before, but when she looked through her pathology textbooks, she noticed a photograph that looked surprisingly similar. It was liver tissue of an individual who had been poisoned with a cancer-causing agent, dimethylnitrosamine, or DMN. DMN is a cancer-causing agent given to animals in cancer research. It was water-soluble, highly toxic, and affects only the liver, and would leave no trace in an autopsy. Dr. Kimbrough now suspected foul play. She told police to look for some connection between the family and someone who worked in a cancer research facility. She suspected Chad Shelton and Dwayne Johnson had been murdered. Dr. Renata Kimbrough suspected that Chad Shelton and Dwayne Johnson had been poisoned with DMN, a compound used to cause cancer in animals. She suspected that the toxin was in the lemonade. Everyone who consumed lemonade that day either got sick or died, but there was no proof. The lemonade was gone, and the pitcher washed.
Things just don't happen like that, to me. And so I thought we ought to look. It just didn't fit.
Burchard interviewed the surviving family members, including Dwayne Johnson's wife, Sandy, asking if they knew of anyone who held a grudge against their family. They all said no. On a hunch, Burchard searched the police computer database, entering the name of Dwayne Johnson, and when he did, he found a surprise. 3 years earlier, when Dwayne and Sandy Johnson were newlyweds, there was a confrontation outside their home with an armed assailant. brother was wounded in the shoulder. Another shot went through a front window. The shooter was an old boyfriend of Sandy's, angry with Dwayne for stealing his girlfriend. His name was Stephen Roy Harper. Stephen Harper met Sandy Johnson in high school. Sandy was a popular, pretty blue-eyed blonde. Harper was an honor student, quiet, and a loner who planned to become a veterinarian. Sandy Johnson was Harper's first girlfriend. Harper was shy around girls. As a child, he was severely burned in a house fire which left him with scars, both physical and psychological.
He always felt self-conscious about that, and he never dated. So very much when Sandy comes along, one love, and that's it.
After the attack in 1975, Harper was arrested, pleaded no contest to the shooting, and was sentenced to up to 5 years in the state penitentiary. But Lieutenant Burchard soon discovered that Harper served only 1 year of that sentence. After Harper was released from prison, he took a job as a lab technician at the Epley Cancer Institute.
I thought, well, maybe this isn't so far-fetched. Maybe I'm really right. And it scared me.
Police obtained a search warrant for Harper's home. In the garage, they found evidence of animal experiments. A local veterinarian told police that a month before Dwayne Johnson and Chad Shelton died, he treated Stephen Harper's dog and cat. They both had unexplained bleeding, and both animals died.
And it was exactly what happened to Dwayne Johnson. And that really convinced me that this is our boy.
But police had a problem. They had plenty of circumstantial evidence linking Harper to the poisonings, but they had no scientific proof. DMN is rapidly metabolized in the body and excreted within hours of ingestion, so there was no trace of it in any of the victims. There was, in effect, no murder weapon.
We had a whole bunch of theories and suppositions, and no evidence is where we were at.
We had to, in some other way, prove that DMN had been there.
At the University of California at Irvine, Dr. Ronald Shank, a cancer researcher, had been conducting animal experiments looking at how cancer-causing agents like DMN altered the DNA.
Dimethylnitrosamine attacks the DNA of the liver cell, and it leaves a chemical footprint on the DNA. That footprint will lead to a mutation which starts the cancer process.
Dr. Kimbrough asked Ronald Shank if he would try something he had never done before, to conduct his first human experiment. She sent 8 coded samples of liver and kidney tissue in order to conduct a blind test. One of the samples belonged to Dwayne Johnson, although Dr. Shank had no idea which one. High-performance liquid chromatography separated the various components of the DNA, and a computer charted those components visualized on a graph.
DNA from 7 of the 8 liver samples was completely normal. One liver sample had DNA that gave us 2 extra peaks in the liquid chromatography. Those 2 extra peaks were identical to what you would see if the individual had been exposed to dimethylnitrosamine.
The liver sample belonged to Dwayne Johnson.
That's what Shank and Kimbrough did for us. They proved it beyond a reasonable doubt that this was a substance used to the exclusion of any other known substance in the world.
Science provided the murder weapon. Other evidence would provide the full picture of Stephen Harper's deranged mind.
What are you doing here? What? No!
When Stephen Harper opened fire on the Johnson family in 1975, he was consumed with both jealousy and rage over Sandy Johnson's rejection. With Harper in prison for the shooting, his bizarre behavior continued. He mailed these pictures depicting Sandy as a witch to her home. Initially, Sandy Johnson couldn't believe that her old boyfriend was capable of murder, which explains why she didn't identify him as a possible suspect. Their unusual relationship was the focus of Thomas Guillen's book, Toxic Love.
She had painted the former boyfriend, Stephen Harper, as a very peaceful person, as a very loving person, as a very good boyfriend. He was not prone to violence, quote unquote. That sort of portrayal. Very puzzling, very perplexing. Why would she do that? I don't know.
After prison, Harper took a job at the Epley Cancer Institute. Published reports say it was here where Harper first learned about the deadly DMN. A newspaper article had been posted on the company's bulletin board describing how a German chemist killed his wife by putting DMN in her marmalade. Authorities believe that Harper confiscated DMN from a locked refrigerator in the lab and experimented at home to find the correct dosage. Harper confided to a friend that he broke into Sandy and Dwayne's home on a Thursday night when no one was there. He poured the DMN in a pitcher of lemonade he found in the refrigerator. The following Sunday afternoon, the Johnsons, Sheltons, and the grandparents all gathered for what would be their last family get-together. Dwayne had been painting outside and had 2 large glasses of the lemonade to quench his thirst. 11-month-old Chad had some lemonade in his cup. Sandy's parents did not drink the lemonade and were drinking coffee instead. Ironically, the presumed target of the sabotage, Sandy Johnson, didn't like lemonade and drank something else. Dwayne died because he ingested 2 full glasses of lemonade, more than the others. Chad was simply too small for his system to handle the toxin. Stephen Harper was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of poisoning with intent to kill. He was sentenced to death in the electric chair. But before that could happen, Harper committed suicide in his cell.
Saddest story that you can ever think of. You know, it was sad enough that a child dies, that people get poisoned, that you have this plot of murder by cancer. But you have living victims. And his plot to kill with cancer may still come to pass.
Sherry Johnson was 2 years old when she ingested the DMN. Although a blood transfusion saved her life, she suffers chronic liver problems to this day. Bruce Shelton was so distraught over the murder of his son Chad and consumed by the fear that he would develop cancer that he lost his job, descended into a life of alcoholism, and died homeless at the age of 38. He was buried beside the infant son he mourned. His wife Sally remarried and reportedly refused to have more children for fear she would develop cancer and not be alive to raise them.
That was the most ingenious way to commit the perfect crime, to commit the perfect murder, and give somebody something that nobody will suspect where they die years later of cancer, and you can't detect it.
And without scientific evidence, the case against Stephen Harper might never have been proven.
I've spent my whole career trying to find out how chemicals cause cancer and try to prevent that process. And it bothers me that there would be people out there who would take a chemical like that and use it to try to cause cancer. a very sick thing.
Sometime after midnight in July of 1986, Stephanie Brown took some friends home who lived in an unfamiliar part of town.
Make sure you go I-5 north. Don't go south or you get lost. Okay?
To get back to her apartment, Brown was told to take Interstate 5 north, a major thoroughfare in California.
I-5 north? Okay, thanks.
Despite the directions, Stephanie Brown made the wrong turn.
Bye-bye.
It took both science and psychology to discover what happened next. A fisherman walking down this trail in a remote mountain area outside of Sacramento, California, discovered the semi-nude body of a young woman lying face down in a flooded irrigation ditch. Around her neck, a band of purple discoloration, the sign of ligature strangulation.
It's a very isolated, desolate area next to a cornfield, and there were no houses or lights or civilization anywhere around. It was a very lonely spot to have been driven to, and certainly she was conscious during the drive. We don't know how long he toyed with her. We don't know how long he assaulted her, how long it was before she was killed.
The autopsy found traces of semen, but the samples were too badly degraded for DNA testing. The victim was identified as 19-year-old Stephanie Brown, who worked as a teller in a Sacramento bank.
Stephanie was a very sensitive, loving, caring daughter who wouldn't hurt anybody. Monday after work, she came by and did laundry. She called a couple of friends on the phone, and then when she was through, she came over and gave us a kiss goodbye. And I just remember her walking out the family room, out the door, waving, you know, her hair in a ponytail, waving, "Bye, Mom, I love you."
When police learned that Stephanie's hair was long and in a ponytail the day before she died, they realized that her killer had cut it. Ray Biondi headed Sacramento's homicide unit.
First thought came to my mind is we're dealing with somebody with a very perverse fetish, cutting hair. And I had never seen this before in hundreds of other murder investigations. Did this person cut the hair and take it away as a trophy or a souvenir? We didn't really know.
Brown's car was found 20 miles away on Interstate 5 and was headed in the opposite direction from her apartment. The car was full of gas and operational. Brown was probably lost and may have stopped to ask someone for directions. Just 1 month later, there was another incident along Interstate 5. 26-year-old Charmaine Sabra and her mother had been out to dinner and were heading home when their car broke down along a deserted stretch of Interstate 5. A man in a dark sports car stopped and offered help.
Ladies having trouble with your car?
Yes. Yeah, I heard a noise, so I pulled over. Now the car won't start.
I'll be happy to give you a ride, but I can only take one. This is only a two-seater.
Back as soon as I can.
That was the last time her mother saw her. In the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains outside of Sacramento, California, a hunter discovered the badly decomposed remains of a white female. The remains had been scattered by animals, but investigators recovered the skull, torso, and some clothing, which included a purple skirt, dark blouse, and a pair of alligator heel shoes. The clothes were similar to those worn by Charmaine Sabra, who disappeared without a trace after accepting a ride 3 months earlier on Interstate 5. Dental x-rays confirmed that the remains were those of Charmaine Sabra. The cause of death was strangulation. The side seam from Charmaine's blouse was cut and used as a ligature around her neck, along with a piece of yellow nylon cord. Her pantyhose had been cut in 2 places and tied around her wrists. There were cuts made to the victim's slip and the shoulder straps of her bra. Criminalist Jim Streeter analyzed the clothing from the crime scene.
I've never seen clothes cutting like that. I've never seen any cutting like that. Talking with other investigators, they've never seen any types of cutting like this. Cuttings would be for some function in any other case we had seen, but in this particular case, it was so unusual that it became his calling card.
The initial cutting is what he uses to arouse himself initially, sexually, and then enables him to complete and perform the rest of the offense.
Like Stephanie Brown, Charmaine Sabra's body was found over 50 miles away from where her car broke down on Interstate 5. Charmaine's mother was not able to provide a detailed description of the driver since she did not see him clearly. All she could say was that he was a white male in his 40s with a large nose and pale skin.
It's hard to imagine that he would take Charmaine, planning to kill her, knowing that he left his mother, her mother, as a witness behind. That makes no sense to me.
Bruce Henderson described the sophistication of this serial killer in his book, Trace Evidence.
He was very good at confounding the police. This killer didn't leave behind easy clues, and he took his victims great distances, and he left clean crime scenes, meaning no fingerprints or anything that could connect him to the crime or to the victim.
2 weeks later, police were called to another homicide 35 miles southeast of Sacramento.
She was hogtied with her own tank top, a victim of ligature strangulation, wherein her arms were bent up behind her back, and then the tank top was looped over her neck.
Her halter top and socks had been cut in the same non-functional way as the other victims. Dental records identified the remains as 20-year-old Laura Hedick. The last time anyone saw her was in an area frequented by prostitutes.
Why don't you go with this guy for a little while?
Laura was with her boyfriend, James Driggers. They needed money for drugs, and Driggers told police that Laura agreed to prostitution.
Are you dating?
Yeah, I know a place to go.
Happy.
Laura left with a customer in a white car. Driggers said he never saw her again. But Driggers took a lie detector test and failed.
Is it the boyfriend or is it not the boyfriend? The first people you must eliminate are those all around the victim.
Police were convinced that the murders were all related. But if Driggers had a hand in his girlfriend's murder, what was his connection to the other victims? A serial murderer was on the loose in Central California, at first abducting women along Interstate 5 and later prowling for prostitutes in downtown Sacramento. Police decoys dressed as prostitutes in an attempt to lure the killer into their trap, and they also posed as motorists in distress along Interstate 5. Despite these efforts, the murders continued. On Sunday, June 21, 1987, in the remote woods of Deer Creek, Amador County, a family on a hiking trip found blood on the trail. The victim was identified as 25-year-old Karen Finch. She she was divorced and the mother of a 2-year-old daughter. Her car was found near Interstate 5, fully operational. Her sandals were still in the car. If she walked barefoot, she hadn't planned to walk far.
There was a piece of fragment of duct tape in her hair, which the light bulbs went on at the time thinking, this is what happened in Stephanie Brown case. That's why her hair was cut.
The killer used duct tape to gag his victims and always cut it off before leaving the scene. He may have known that the sticky side of tape is a rich source of fingerprints. But this time, something went wrong. Karen Finch probably fought back, and when she did, the killer used what he had in his hand, the scissors, to stab her. The killer left the scene without removing all of the tape. Unfortunately, there were no fingerprints on the piece of tape he left behind.
The bodies were found some distance from where he would have been able to park his vehicle. Some of these distances were too far that he would have carried them, so we're certain that they were made to walk. They may have had their hands bound at that time.
A few weeks later, police had yet another victim. The new decomposed body of 17-year-old Darcy Frackenpole was found in a deserted area off Highway 50 near Lake Tahoe. The cause of death was strangulation. Her blouse was tied around her neck with a wood garrote. 2 pieces of rope were found near her clothing. The rope was made of nylon, and after checking with several rope suppliers, police discovered that it was the type of rope used in parachute cords. Cutting the victim's clothing was important to the killer for some reason. So important that he did this in all of his murders. So important, he would carry a pair of scissors to every crime to carry out the ritual.
I cried for all the victims. It was just so emotional. After a year and a half of working on all this physical evidence, trying to link everyone together and trying to find the person that did this so that it wouldn't happen again, and just be overwhelming at times.
The killer was experienced. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he perfected his technique with every case. The only lead police had in their search for the serial killer was the way in which he carried out the murders. His signature characteristics included the rope and the clothes cutting. A few months later, an unrelated incident caught homicide's attention. Deborah Guffey was a street prostitute in downtown Sacramento who told police an interesting story.
Hey, you working tonight?
Been here waiting for you.
Why don't you get in? We'll go for a ride.
When he parked the car, he turned violent, smashing Guffey's head into the dashboard and tried to handcuff her. Guffey managed to escape. A policeman was driving nearby, saw the altercation and stopped to investigate. 48-year-old Roger Kibbe was charged with the assault. He was the manager of a public storage facility, married, and had a daughter from an earlier marriage. A background check on Roger Kibbe revealed an arrest 30 years earlier, at the age of 15, for stealing women's underwear off their clotheslines and cutting it in a random, non-functional way with a pair of his mother's scissors. Kibbe told police at the time he had a terrible relationship with his mother. Roger Kibbe was also a parachutist, another coincidence, since parachute rope had been found at one of the murder sites. Kibbe's brother was a homicide detective in Nevada. Another coincidence, since police suspected that the killer knew homicide investigative techniques. Roger Kibbe owned two different cars. One was similar to the car which picked up Charmaine Sabra. In the other, police found some rope with a garrote tied to the ends, a set of handcuffs, and scissors.
We knew who our killer was. It was Roger Kibbe, but we lacked the evidence to actually file any murder charges against him.
Criminalist Faye Springer is an expert in exchange or trace evidence that can link a suspect or victim to a crime scene. Springer pored over the thousands of hairs, fibers, and other materials found on the victim's clothing. She found two carpet fibers on Darcy Frackenpole's dress. They were blue, triangular in shape, made of nylon, and were manufactured by the DuPont Company. When she compared the fibers to the carpet in Roger Kibbe's automobile, she discovered that they were the same color, size, shape, made of the same polymer, and dyed with the same chemicals. And when Springer looked closer, she saw something else on the fibers.
I noticed when I was looking at the fibers microscopically that there were some contaminants on the surface. It was a football-shaped particle that turned out later to be identified as a fungal spore.
The same fungal spores were on the fibers from the floor mat of Kibbe's car. The human hair found on one of the victim's dress was microscopically similar to hair taken from Roger Kibbe's inner thigh. When Springer turned her attention to the pantyhose used to tie Charmaine Sabra's wrists, she noticed something which had previously been overlooked.
The benefit of being a woman criminalist and working sexual assault type homicides is that we know that when the pantyhose come off, they come off inside out. Men just wouldn't know that unless they actually had pantyhose on.
With the pantyhose turned the proper way, Springer discovered several small fibers on the back of the leg area. When Springer compared those fibers to the fibers on the seat of one of Roger Kibbe's automobiles, they were microscopically similar. Finally, Springer analyzed the pieces of rope found in Kibbe's car and in his storage shed. At first glance, it appeared to be identical to the rope found near Darcy Frackenpole's body. Both were made of white nylon, with 6 fibers running through the cord and 32 threads per cord. But Faye Springer noticed something peculiar when she looked at the rope under the microscope.
I noticed that there was red paint on the cordage and some black particles. Later, Kay Malsby said that she had some cordage from an assault case that Kibbe was involved in. She brought that out. I looked at it. I noticed the same particles were on that cordage. This was a very strong link to Roger Kibbe and Darcy Frackenpole.
But the size of the paint particles was tiny, about 6 microns, which is 6 millionths of a meter. With the scanning electron microscope, scientists performed an elemental analysis of the inorganic compounds of the paint. They found 10 different elements in the paint mixture, common in the chemical formulation of red acrylic paint, but they found 2 additional elements in the paint which were not: sodium and chlorine. These were contaminants in the air when the paint was sprayed near the rope. All 3 pieces of rope had the same red paint and the same contaminants. The rope found near Darcy Frackenpole's body, the rope found in Roger Kibbe's car and in Kibbe's storage shed, all were in the same area when someone was using a can of red acrylic spray paint.
The cordage was basically the coup de grace of the People's case. It was extremely unique. Commonality was the red paint stains on each one of these cords at those 3 scenes, which meant Roger Kibbe was at the scenes. I said, he's boxed in, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to bury him, he's guilty.
Roger Kibbe was charged with the murder of Darcy Frackenpole. On March 18, 1991, he was found guilty of murder in the 1st degree and was sentenced to 25 years to life. Kibbe still faces the possibility of murder charges in the other deaths.
Roger is in prison for only one murder. There has to be another trial. These other families need to see some kind of reconciliation in court.
The police and prosecution were unaware that Kibbe confessed to his wife shortly after his arrest.
And I didn't know that he had murdered anybody until that night. Police arranged for me to get in the back seat of a cruiser with him. And he told me that he had killed 5 people. Well, 4. Excuse me, 4. I cried. He cried. I asked him why. But when you're sobbing, I mean, we were sobbing. He said he didn't know.
I came away from there just feeling and overcoming with the thought that this is not enough. This just is not enough. My daughter is laying there, and so are many, many other girls laying there. And this man, all he can say, what is the big fuss about? I killed a few girls.
The horror that Darcy and the fear that Darcy Frankenpool must have felt before going. Stephanie Brown. How frightened she must have been. I'm so sorry.
In the fall of 1987, a map maker was surveying the grounds of a Boy Scout ranch in eastern Missouri. Suddenly, something strange caught his eye. At first, it looked like a turtle shell, but it was a skull. A mystery now unfolded. To solve it, detectives would have to put a face on the grisly discovery. The S-Bar-F Boy Scout Ranch covers 5,400 acres of picturesque countryside in rural Missouri. The mapmaker had discovered the human skull in a remote area of the ranch. Tina Orling was his supervisor.
He was a professional mapmaker from Finland, and he saw the skull within the first few days here. He did not say anything to me or to anyone else about it because he was afraid.
But 3 months later, just before he returned to Finland, the mapmaker finally told Tina about the skull. Using a detailed map of the ranch and following the mapmaker's directions, Tina and the scout ranger searched for the skull. They found what they were looking for in a sparsely wooded clearing.
The sun was glinting off this white object. You could tell right away it was a skull, and I thought to myself, oh boy, we finally found it.
Along with the skull, searchers found a few strands of hair, a lower jaw, and about 40 bones, including a pelvic bone, a femur, and some ribs.
My initial thought was that it may possibly be an Indian grave until we saw the blue jean material.
Searchers unearthed the tattered remains of a pair of jeans. pieces of a flowered shirt, remnants of a plastic shopping bag, and a metal button. To begin the task of identifying the victim, the physical evidence was sent to the Forensic Crime Lab in Jefferson City, Missouri. They began their evaluation with the tattered blue jeans. The outside seam was intact. This helped criminalist Tom Grant determine the overall height of the victim. From cuff to waistband, the outside seam measured 37 inches.
Based on that outside measurement, the inside seam length would probably have been approximately 27 to 28 inches, which is from a short person who would have worn that pair of jeans.
Grant estimated the victim's height to be about 5 feet, and scientists discovered evidence of foul play in the dirt itself when they analyzed a white substance which they found mixed in with the soil at the grave.
The trace section of our laboratory analyzed those and determined the presence of calcium carbonate, which could have been a byproduct of calcium oxide, which is lime.
People put lime there to either stop the odor of the decomposing body or to actually cause it to decompose faster.
Scientists analyzed the hair found at the gravesite. Hair can be identified as either Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid. But the hair was badly damaged. The only conclusion scientists could reach was that it was not Negroid.
The hair on the left is the hair from the gravesite. The hair that's on the right is a Negroid or African American head hair, and its characteristics differ considerably from that at the gravesite. So I would determine that the hair at the gravesite is not of African American origin.
The preliminary information indicated that the victim was a female Caucasian. She was short, about 5 feet tall. Police sent this information to the National Crime Center, a database of all missing persons in the United States and Canada.
And that was unsuccessful. We believed it to be murder. The problem was identifying who the victim was.
Really, the first thought on my mind was this is probably going to be one that we won't be able to solve.
But were investigators even on the right track? One tiny piece of evidence unearthed from the shallow grave would change the course of the investigation and take medical detectives halfway around the world. Investigators believe that the skeletal remains found in the shallow grave had been there for less than 8 years and were those of a petite Caucasian female. One piece of evidence had puzzled investigators from the start: the small metal button found with the remains.
Half of it was somewhat rusted and deteriorated, but the upper half had a logo that was stamped on it. The letters TEXWOOD was present, Tex Wood, and in the O's there was a star-type pattern that was present. None of us at our laboratory had ever seen or heard of that logo before.
But not even the FBI had heard of a product or company by the name of Tex Wood.
So we began calling all over the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Couldn't find it. So I called a friend of mine with U.S. Customs.
U.S. Customs Special Agent Timothy Quinn entered the name Texwood in his computer. What he discovered gave investigators the first crucial break they needed to identify the victim.
Checks of our computerized importer files were negative. Then had to make a series of phone calls, the last of which was to our national import specialists in New York. And from the Office of the National Import Specialist, we were able to determine that the name Texwood is a make of jeans that was manufactured strictly for consumption in Asia. The brand was not intended to be exported to the United States.
This meant that either the victim had traveled to Asia before her death and purchased the jeans there, or was in fact Asian. To find out more, the bones were sent first to anthropologists at the University of Missouri and later to Colorado State University.
If you have the right bones, you can find out everything you need. You don't need a complete skeleton. The more you have, the more complete picture you can have.
For instance, a skull can tell an anthropologist about gender and race. The first step was to determine whether the skull was Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid, which includes Native Americans and Asians. A Mongoloid skull usually has broad, squared cheekbones. The anthropologist confirmed police suspicions that the skull was Mongoloid.
The bridge of the nose, the squared cheekbones, the overall smaller features led me to believe that this was Mongoloid.
The anthropologist confirmed that the victim was indeed female. Since the cranial sutures were closed, and judging from the wear of her teeth, the anthropologist estimated that she was young, most likely in her mid-20s. The bones had smooth surfaces, an indication that the victim was not particularly muscular. Anthropologists estimated her weight to be approximately 120 pounds. And they learned something else from examining her pelvic bone. When a woman has delivered at least 2 children, the separating process of the pelvic bones creates a groove like this one. Such a groove was found on the pelvic bone at the grave site. Investigators now knew that the victim had given birth to at least 2 children. Still, they were at a dead end.
It's very frustrating because you cannot start the investigation of who committed the crime until you determine who the victim is. And you continually, it's like spinning your wheels, not going anywhere until you can identify the victim.
With little else to go on, the next step was to give the unidentified skull a face. The skeletal remains told authorities what they were looking for: an Asian female who had given birth to at least 2 children. They knew she was petite, standing about 5 feet tall and weighing about 120 pounds. But what did she look like? Police asked the anthropologist to bring the skull to life through the technique of facial reconstruction. First, the reconstructionist makes a latex mold of the actual skull. Once the mold is made, the skull can be returned to police to be used as evidence. Then a plaster cast is made from the latex mold. Using this plaster cast, rubber pegs called landmarks are glued onto the cast. They represent tissue thicknesses at various points on the face. Facial tissue thicknesses differ from men and women and vary with race and age. Next, the landmarks are connected with strips of clay following the contours of the skull.
Each individual skull is like a blueprint or a fingerprint. No 2 are alike. We follow this blueprint then to create our faces, following the shape, the bends of each skull.
The spaces between the clay strips are then filled in to flesh out the face. Plastic brown eyes are carefully aligned and set in the sockets, and lids are molded. Final touches include a nose and lips. And because the victim was presumed to be Asian, the bust was given a black wig. The identity of the victim was still unknown, but police now had an important tool in their investigation, a face they hoped would jar someone's memory. They sent photographs of the bust to newspapers and television stations in the nearby cities, hoping for a response. The wait lasted just 3 days.
Skeletal remains of a woman were found in St.
Wheelie Porn Cox was watching television when she saw the bust on a local news program.
Then I called my husband, tell my husband what I saw in the TV.
Her husband Carmen picked up a newspaper, looked at the bust, and thought he recognized it as well.
Called her back. I said, boy, it's awful close. I think we ought to do something.
The Coxes said the bust looked like their friend who lived in a nearby town, 33-year-old Bunchy Nyhouse, whom they hadn't seen for the past 5 years. They told police that Bunchy had left her husband Richard and had returned home to her native Thailand. When police questioned Richard Nyhouse, he did not believe that the skull found at the Boy Scout ranch 100 miles away from his home was that of his wife Bunchy. Richard said Bunchy had told him that she missed her family in Thailand and that she wanted to divorce him. He said he personally drove her to the St. Louis airport 5 years earlier to take her flight to Thailand. He said that was the last time he and his children saw her, and they never heard from her again. And neighbors confirmed that Bunchy had in fact spoken of returning to Thailand.
I knew she told me she had gotten her passport. She had gotten her citizenship and her passport. So it wouldn't have surprised me, you know, if she had done that.
She mentioned to me, you know, she's not happy. She like to go Thailand, visit family.
And if Bunchy was indeed the woman found in the shallow grave, why hadn't her family in Thailand reported her missing during the last 5 years? For the information police needed, scientists once again looked for answers in the bones. Had Bunchy Nyhouse left behind her 2 children and returned to Thailand as her husband claimed? Or were her remains those found in the shallow grave at the Boy Scout Ranch? The answer lay in the skull and a technique called skull photograph superimposition. Police obtained this photograph of Bunchy from her husband Richard and sent it to the anthropology department at Colorado State University. Police also included a photograph of another Asian woman who was reported missing in Georgia. The photographic work was done by the late Dr. Michael Charney, a world-renowned forensic anthropologist at Colorado State University. Charney positioned the skull in the same pose as the photographs of both women, then superimposed slides of the skull over the photographs. The skull did not match the woman from Georgia, but it did match the photo of Bunchy Nyhouse perfectly.
Face is at an angle. She's clowning around making a face. We find that the jawline is within the chin, the top is within the top of the head, the cheek is within, the eyes are in the orbits, the nasal opening corresponds to the nose, and the teeth match up very nicely to the jawline here. In spite of the fact that it's a very difficult angle to approximate, an expression to approximate, we felt this was a very good match.
Now armed with a positive scientific identification, police turned their attention to Richard Nyhouse. They suspected that he knew more about his wife's disappearance than he was telling them.
Her friends indicated that they had a very volatile relationship, that they argued quite a bit.
And police also learned of a disturbing coincidence, that Richard Nyhouse was a Boy Scout leader and often camped at the Boy Scout Ranch where police discovered Bunchy's grave.
And I turned to my partner and we looked at each other and we just couldn't believe it. That's when we knew we had to formulate a game plan, and we'd have probably just one shot at him.
It all started fitting together at that point. All the pieces started coming into place.
When police confronted Richard Nyhouse with the forensic evidence, he confessed, although he gave conflicting accounts of what actually happened. He said Bunchy fell during a scuffle and hit her head accidentally, but admitted suffocating his wife.
She was bleeding real bad. There was blood all over the place, and she was yelling again. So I put my hands over her mouth and her nose and suffocated her.
In light of the confession, forensic pathologist Dr. Mary Case examined the skull. She studied the small wound on the back of the skull and concluded that it was not the result of an accident, but rather the result of blunt trauma to the head.
This is a very limited area. It's pushed inward, and we tend to see this kind of a depressed skull fracture when you strike the head with something that has very forceful impact over a very small striking surface. A hammer would be a good example of something that could do that. It's a tool. It's meant to strike, and all of the force is directed onto a very small striking surface.
Based on the forensic evidence and parts of Nyhouse's confession, prosecutors believe that Richard and Bunchy argued one night in the basement of their home.
We're not moving.
We've been through this before. We are not moving, all right?
Bunchie wanted to move into a new house. Richard refused, saying they couldn't afford it.
And I'm taking the boys and leaving.
The blow to her head was not fatal, but while she lay bleeding on the floor, Richard suffocated her. He used a service merchandise bag to contain the bleeding, wrapped the body in a sheet of plastic, and placed her in the freezer, where she remained for the next 3 months. Nyhouse fabricated the story about driving Bunchie to the St. Louis airport for a flight to Thailand. When spring arrived and the ground thawed, Richard took Bunchie's body to the Boy Scout Ranch, a 2-hour drive from his home. He chose a secluded area deep in the woods for the burial, but made a number of mistakes. The lime he spread over the body most likely aided decomposition, but the grave was only 2 feet deep, not deep enough to keep burrowing animals from bringing her bones to the surface. And Bunchie was buried in Texwood jeans, which told a story, since they were made and sold exclusively in Asia. Nyhouse never anticipated that his wife's remains would be discovered, and if they were, that they would ever be successfully identified. Finding the Texwood button, the pelvic bone that revealed the victim had at least 2 children, the mongoloid skull, the forensic sculpture, and the photographic superimposition all were essential elements in the identification. During the trial, Dr. Case testified that it takes between 3 and 5 minutes to suffocate an individual. After a minute or 2, the person would only be unconscious. It was entirely possible that Nyhouse put his wife into the freezer while she was still alive. Richard Nyhouse was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 50 years.
It was great forensic science, and of course, that's how it's supposed to work. You get a button, you get a hair, and the expert in that area can tell you. And if you look at the button work, it took about a month. It was less than a month for someone to look at that button and say, well, that's only manufactured in that part of the world. Well, somebody had to collect all that information, and I admire that. I think that's wonderful.
It took all the different scientific and forensic people to make this thing happen, any one piece of which could have stopped the investigation.
One of the unique things about the case was actually having the remains to do the trial, and Bunchie Nyhouse actually came alive in her own trial. This was one of the few cases where a prosecutor got to try a murder case with the victim actually in the courtroom with him, speaking to the jury.